little bit about winter foraging with goats. This is something that I've been experimenting with this year, and there were a number of reasons why I decided to try it. One of them is that goats do not do well in confinement. They're not very well adapted to living in small spaces. They, if left to their own devices, will cover a lot of ground in a day if they're in their natural habitat. You know, searching out the best forages and shrubs and plants to eat. And I feel like a lot of the issues that you see with goats come from the fact that they're being raised in high confinement, and they're just not well adapted to that. So here in the Midwest, we can get anything from 50 degrees down to below zero in the winter. So our winter temperatures vary quite a lot. And so it's difficult to have a setup where your goats are out on the land all the time in the winter, especially for me because I milk all winter long, and I have to have them at the barn at least twice a day. So what I've tried this year is I just have been taking them out in a couple of pastures that we have that are empty right now. They don't have any pigs or anything in them, and I've just been letting them graze and browse out in the pastures on warmer days when the weather is decent. And I have to say, I really didn't have a lot of expectations going into this, other than knowing that exercise and fresh air would be beneficial, and that the goats would enjoy kind of poking around and finding different foods to eat besides just their normal hay and grain ration. And because they are dairy goats, so they're either growing, milking, or pregnant, or sometimes, as in the case of Pippi back here, both milking and pregnant, they have pretty high requirements as far as feed intake. So I am not relying on these foraging days for you know, a basis of their feed ration. They're still getting their normal hay ration at night, and of course their normal feed ration as well when they're on the milking stand. So you know, this is not replacing any of that. I don't think it's saving me anything in hay costs. But I do notice a difference in their health and their activity levels. You know, it's very common for goats to get kind of snotty noses and respiratory things, really any time of the year when they're in confinement, but especially I notice it in the winter time, because it doesn't matter how hard I work, the bedding in their sheds or shelters tends to get kind of gross, and you know, they're laying in that and breathing those fumes, and it's just not really very good for them. And of course, when they're not moving around and their system, you know, isn't circulating as well. And so I've just noticed a huge difference as far as health goes with their respiratory things. You know, I'll notice in the morning when I take them out, you know, a lot of them will kind of have snotty noses, or I'll hear some coughs and sneezes. But then when I bring them back in at night, you know, the noses are usually cleared up. I'm not hearing any coughing, not hearing any sneezing. You know, just having the exercise and the fresh air and sunshine is really beneficial for them. But I also have been studying, just watching the forages that they're choosing to eat at this time of year. And since it does get quite cold here, and it's currently February, so we've been through some really cold days. The winter weather has killed off a lot of the forages and plants that are normally available. Pippi, don't do that. But there are a number of things out here that they have been eating, and so I just sat down and did a little research on what they've been eating, and you know, possibly why they've been choosing those things. So one of the things I've noticed that they enjoy is a plant called buckbrush or coralberry, and it has leaves that they will eat during the summertime. Right now there's not really any leaves on it, but they have been eating the berries. So I did a little research on the berries. They are mildly toxic. Goats eat a lot of mildly toxic things. And I don't worry about it very much anymore, except for, you know, with some things like wilted wild cherry leaves and things like that that are actually highly toxic in small amounts, because they seem to be very smart about choosing what to eat and what not to eat. And they tend to, if they have adequate nutrition and a lot of options, they tend to kind of sample different plants, and so they'll only eat a little bit at a time, and if it makes them feel bad, then that's probably one that they won't go back to. So all of that to say, the buckbrush berries, they are mildly toxic because they have saponins in them, but according to the Missouri Department of Conservation, they also have, I guess, kind of a nasty bitter taste. I haven't eaten one yet, so I can't attest to this, but an ongoing process of freezing and thawing might make them more palatable. So I thought that was quite interesting, since this is late winter and, you know, they have frozen and thawed a number of times, so maybe they taste better now than they did, you know, last fall. And another, goats keep trying to eat my camera here. Another thing that the Missouri Department of Conservation mentioned was that they are a food source for white-tailed deer. And goats and deer are very similar in a lot of ways. So, you know, if it's something that the deer eat, I figure there's a reason that the deer are eating them, and then the goats may really enjoy them as well. Another thing that they really like is multiflora rose. This grows everywhere here. It's kind of an obnoxious plant, honestly. It takes over and creates these huge brambly, thorny thickets. But as probably a lot of you know, multiflora rose is very high in vitamin C. I believe the entire plant is high in vitamin C. I haven't found a lot of information, but obviously rose hips are, and rose hips are something that's available this time of year. And I do see the goats eating those. And there's a lot of, obviously, vitamin C and antioxidants kind of go together in a lot of plants. So you see a lot of antioxidants in the rose as well. I did some research, and I will be linking a lot of pages and just different research projects and things that I have found at the bottom of this video, so you might want to check those out. But some of the research that I did indicated that the crude protein in roses, specifically multiflora roses, was about 14.5%, and the digestibility was about 67%. So this is a very highly digestible food source. And the calcium to phosphorus ratio is about 5.9 to 1. So there's a lot of calcium in rose, and I thought that that was quite interesting because my dairy goats, obviously, they're putting a lot of calcium into their milk production, and so this could be a really good forage source for both milking goats and pregnant does who are putting a lot of calcium into the formation of the bones of the developing kids that they're carrying. One of the things that makes roses such a good food source is the fact that they hold their leaves pretty well into the winter, and they also begin leafing out very, very early in the spring. So right now in mid-February, I'm already seeing leaf buds on some of the roses. And so, you know, as animals are coming out of that winter season, their immune systems are often kind of low and weakened. The roses can provide a great source of vitamin C and antioxidants to kind of boost their system and help them, you know, stay healthy until more forages are available later on in the spring. I have a fun story about multiflora rose. My doe Syl went through a really rough patch last year. She's way back in the background there. But anyway, she got sick. I had to use several rounds of antibiotics to get her over her sickness, and then because of the antibiotics, her rumen actually started to shut down, so she was not eating. And Rose was one of the few things that I could actually get her to eat. The roses were leafing out, and they were one of the few things that was green that I could get. And so every day I would go out there and with my pruning shears and cut a whole bunch of rose branches for her, and she would eat them. And honestly, I feel like that is one of the things that contributed to saving her life. So roses are kind of a favorite food source in my book, or one that I feel like has been very beneficial, despite the fact that they are very much of a nuisance here. Another thing I noticed the goats eating a lot of is locust pods, and these are a leftover food source. They fall in the autumn months, and so I noticed the goats eating them a lot in the fall, but there are still some on the ground, and the goats really like to kind of pick through them. And I'm not sure how they decide which ones are good and which ones aren't, because sometimes they pick the most scruffy, nasty looking ones, and the perfect looking pods are passed over. But anyway, they have some kind of criteria for deciding on what's good and what's not there. The locust pods, I did some research on those in the fall, and I noticed that they were really going after them and eating them a lot. They can have up to 16% protein. Obviously this varies a lot from tree to tree and season to season. And they have a lot of sugars, 15 to 26%, and fats about 7%. So it's a pretty good food source, honestly. There was actually some research done, I want to say back in the 20s. I'll try to find that again and link to it. But anyway, it was basically a guy who went and did a whole bunch of research on growing locust trees as a food source for livestock. One caution with the locust trees is they have really big nasty thorns. I have actually stepped on a thorn. They will go, they'll go through the sole of your boot, they'll go through tractor tires, and they can cause really nasty allergic reactions in some people. So if you have locust on your property, be cautious. However, I have not ever had issues with the goats having problems from the thorns, and they definitely do enjoy the pods and the leaves, so those are definitely a good food source. Acorns, again, those are another fall food source, but we had a really good acorn year this year, we had a really good acorn year this past year, and so there are still acorns on the ground. So when the snow is not too deep, the goats will go through and eat acorns. I had originally thought that acorns were really high in protein, but I did some more research on them, and it turns out I was actually wrong. They have a lower protein. It's about 6%, and again, these percentages are going to vary widely depending on what type of tree, what area you're in, the growing conditions, all of that kind of thing. They have a lot of carbohydrates, about 42%, and fats about 52%. So this is really good in the fall, I feel like, because I like to see my goats looking a little chubby going into the winter, because it can be really hard on them, especially on the little ones. And so they really go after those fall acorn crops. And now in the winter time, obviously they're still eating them whenever they can find some that haven't spoiled or rotted sitting on the ground for the past couple of months. They are very high in tannins, and those can cause toxicity issues and problems for other types of livestock. However, I have never had an issue with that in the goats, and I believe it's because the goats have really adapted to being able to process those tannins through their digestive system. One thing I will say is that my girl Josie, who's right back there with the bell on, she is prone to foundering. She's a very easy keeper, and I have had issues with her actually foundering on the acorns. So one thing that I have done is when I know she's eating a lot of acorns, I watch her very, very carefully for signs that she may be starting to founder, and I will actually reduce her feed ration that I give her on the milking stand during times when she's eating a lot of acorns, just to kind of level her out, so she doesn't founder and have those kinds of issues. I will say the milk when the girls are eating acorns is so incredibly rich and thick and creamy. It's just amazing. The fat content just skyrockets when they're on acorns. Japanese honeysuckle is a plant that is another very, very prolific invasive species here on this property. And this was not one that I knew a whole lot about, beyond that the goats, did seem to enjoy eating it. As I did some research on it, I found out that it's actually a very interesting forage plant. The extract from honeysuckle has actually been shown to reduce the effects of heat stress in dairy cattle. So obviously that doesn't have any bearing on winter forage issues, but I just thought that was an interesting little tidbit that I found out. They are full of antioxidants as well. They boost the immune system, and they have about 16.7% crude protein, and the digestibility of Japanese honeysuckle is about 68.5%. So again, a fairly high protein, fairly digestible forage source. One thing that I really like about the honeysuckle is that it keeps its leaves pretty much all year round. So that is something that they can really go after even in the coldest weather when everything else has died back. Autumn olive is another invasive species here, and it's actually one that the goats don't like as much as some of these other ones that I have mentioned, but they do eat it, and it is again one that begins to leaf out a lot earlier than most of the native species do in the springtime. So it can provide some early in the season fresh forage for the goats. The crude protein of autumn olive is about 26.5%. The digestibility is about 63%. And the fruits of the autumn olive, which you would get more in the fall and late summer, they don't typically stay on the tree into the winter. They are a source of vitamins A, C, and E. So I am not really sure why my goats don't care that much for autumn olive. It seems like it should be a great forage, but I guess we have enough other good forages available that it's not all that exciting to them. One thing that I found interesting about autumn olive is that even though it is an invasive species, you probably don't want to encourage those to grow on your property. But they are able to fix nitrogen in the soil, so they can be beneficial to other plants to encourage growth for plants that need extra nitrogen and aren't as efficient at drawing it out of the soil and fixing it for themselves. The final forage that I want to talk about is pine, and pine is one that you may have already heard of because it has a lot of health benefits for humans as well as for animals. So the goats will eat the bark and the needles, and as far as I can tell, the bark and the needles are both fairly comparable to each other as far as nutritional value / medicinal properties. So the bark contains antioxidants and vitamin C. It can help improve respiratory function and heart health. The respiratory function really caught my attention because, again, goats often suffer from respiratory issues in the winter time, and it can be antiparasitic. There are some studies that have showed a parasite reduction in goats that were fed pine bark. I believe it was powdered and added to their feed ration. So that is a possibility. I think it would be interesting for more studies to be done on that. That is something that the goats really love. In fact, I kind of do watch them. So far, I have not had any issues with them actually doing damage to the pine trees. But you know, if you had a lot of goats in a pasture that didn't have very many pine trees, they could potentially actually kill the trees by girdling them and stripping all of the bark off. So that would be something to watch. Again, I haven't had any issues with that, but that could be a possibility. The thing I find so fascinating about goats is that they seem to really have a pretty good sense for what the good food sources are. And it is a little bit odd, you know, you walk past the pasture and there's all this honeysuckle on the ground and they're over there stripping pine bark. But I'm like, well, hey, they probably know that that's something that's good for them. And sure enough, when I researched it, I was like, well, if I was a goat, I would probably be eating pine bark too. So one thing I did want to note is a lot of these studies that I have cited and that I will link below were done in other parts of the US. So, you know, here in Missouri, the nutritional profiles are probably slightly different because, you know, the soil is different and we have a different growing environment. Even here on my farm, it's probably different than it is a few miles down the road. But I do feel like the studies are useful because they do kind of give me a rough idea of what I'm looking at as far as nutritional value. And also a lot of the studies that I've read are geared more towards humans. There really haven't been a lot of good scientific studies done on goats. And so I'm also looking at information for cattle and sheep and humans. But at least as far as I can tell, for a lot of the natural medicine side of things, the medicinal properties are about the same across most, if not all, species. So if I see something that's, you know, good for the immune system in a human, there's a very good chance that if it's a natural product, such as, you know, the vitamin C found in rose hips, it's probably going to be good for goats and have about the same effect on their immune system as well. One other thing I wanted to touch on is the fact that if you are doing winter foraging, you do need to obviously think about the weather and think about the elements. You don't want your goats getting super cold and super wet, especially if they aren't very well adapted to that kind of environment. Obviously, some goats are very tough and they can probably handle being out, you know, most of the time in the winter. Mine are not. So I try to only take them out on days when the weather is decent. I mean, it was 17 degrees when I brought them out here this morning, but it was sunny. The wind wasn't too bad. And you know, they're fine. They're not shivering. They're doing just fine out here. Cold and wet is a lot harder on them than cold and dry. Something I've started doing when we have snow cover, when it was deeper, a few weeks ago we had almost 9 inches of snow, and I actually went and shoveled an area for them to loaf in. It was a sunny spot that they like to hang out in, and I shoveled the snow out of it so that it wasn't so deep, and then I spread some hay and some cardboard sheets down so they would have a dry place to lay down and chew their cud during the afternoon. And I've done that here as well. I'll show you some video of the little loafing area I made for them. Up at the top of this pasture, it was in a sunny area as well. And that really helps them to just have a dry, sunny place where they can lay down and get out of the snow and chew their cud and relax. They enjoy that. And in these pastures, I really don't have shelters set up at all because I'm only putting them out here when the weather is nice. So I don't even worry about the shelters. I just have the hay down to keep them out of the snow, and that really seems to be sufficient. Obviously, you need to have water available as well, even in the cold weather, especially with your milk goats. They're going to need water even when it's cold, and it will freeze. So I have a dark green bucket that I keep their water in, and I try to set that in a sunny spot. So when it freezes, the sun can kind of thaw it out quickly and help melt some of that ice. And I just, you know, top it off whenever it needs to be topped off, break the ice out of it, whatever needs to be done. And so it's pretty simple and easy. And I do think, you know, this has not revolutionized my goats' health. but I do feel like they're healthier and happier, and they enjoy being out here. They're happy to come out in the mornings, and they're ready to go, you know, when I open up the barn. So they're definitely enjoying it as well.